so today we are going to continue our study of the 8 comma rules. You have already gone over comma rules 1 and 2, so just as a quick recap, comma rule 1, we are looking at items in a series and separating those items out with commas. We also talked about that Oxford comma, right? And then our second comma rule is using a comma and a coordinating conjunction, or a fanboy, to separate 2 independent clauses. And remember, you only use the comma if, I knew you knew it, only if there's an independent clause on each side. That knowledge of independent and dependent clauses is going to be really, really useful for the comma rule that we're about to look at together. So we're going to go over the comma rule, we're going to do a quick recap of independent and dependent clauses, and then I'm going to give you some tips and tricks to help you with this comma rule, okay? So make sure that you record this in your composition notebook. If you would like to just continue with wherever you left off with your last set of notes, we are starting with comma rule 3. So these can all just roll together in your composition notebook, okay? Comma rule 3, use a comma to separate dependent clauses from independent clauses if the dependent clause comes first. Notice I double underlined that, because that's going to be really, really important for this comma rule, okay? So, really quick, before we get into some examples, I want to do a quick review of independent and dependent clauses. So remember, an independent clause is going to be made up of a subject or a predicate, a subject and a predicate, which is essentially a subject and a verb and a complete thought. So, for example, Mama tried, right? Mama is your subject, tried is your verb. That can stand on its own as a complete sentence because it is a complete thought. So if you're ever unsure, ask yourself, can it stand on its own? And if that's the case, it is an independent clause. Okay? Now, as far as dependent clauses, they typically only have the subject or the verb, and sometimes they don't have either or neither. All right? So, for example, after dinner, that is a dependent clause because there is no subject or no verb. We don't know who did what after dinner. Right? So, this is an incomplete thought. That cannot stand on its own. So again, your knowledge of what an independent clause looks like and what a dependent clause looks like is going to be really, really, really important for making sure that you follow this comma rule correctly, okay? So again, if you read the comma rule, it says to use, you only use the comma to separate the independent and dependent clause if the dependent clause comes first. So I'm going to show you an example of that, and I'm going to use this dependent clause that I've already created after dinner. So remember, after dinner is a dependent clause. You'll have to forgive me, guys, I don't have an eraser, so I'm using tissue. Okay, so let's record these examples together, okay? So I already said that after dinner was a dependent clause. So let's look at that in a sentence. We went for a walk after dinner. Okay? So, if we look at this sentence, we know that this sentence is made up of both an independent and a dependent clause. So, if we were going to split them, we know this is our independent clause because we have a subject, we have a verb, and we have a complete thought. Okay? So, this here is an independent clause. It can stand on its own. I could put a period right there. We went for a walk. Okay? I can't say the same for after dinner. There's no subject, there's no verb. So this is considered the dependent clause. So based on our rule, do we need a comma in this sentence? The answer is no, because our independent clause came before our dependent clause. So it does not need a comma. We only need a comma if the dependent clause comes first. Well, what does that look like? Well, let's take a gander. After dinner, we went for a walk. So I've said the exact same thing. The only difference is I decided to start with my dependent clause, and it still makes sense. After dinner, we went for a walk, right? So if I'm looking at this sentence, I'm going to first identify my subject, which is we. What did we do? We went. So if I look at this sentence, I can immediately tell that this here is my independent clause. We went for a walk, okay? Now, after dinner is a dependent clause. Since I put the dependent clause before the independent clause, this sentence needs a comma, okay? So again, the exact same sentence. We went for a walk after dinner. Even though it's basically saying the same thing, I don't have to use a comma here because my independent, right, got my subject and my verb, came before my dependent. See the difference? Now, let's say that you're not 100% sure where the independent ends and the dependent begins, okay? Because what I've seen students do in the past is they're unable to identify this as the dependent clause because they consider it a part of the independent clause, okay? So I'm going to teach you a little trick here. We're going to switch colors. So we're going to make a note here. This is like one of those dirty tips and tricks that if you know is going to be really helpful. Most dependent clauses begin with a subordinating conjunction. Okay? Most begin with a subordinating conjunction. So for instance, here, we went for a walk after dinner. After is an example of a subordinating conjunction. So I want to interject here for just a second. I know that when we are looking at the parts of speech, it can get really frustrating. It's like, why do I have to know this? This is one of those instances where knowing your conjunctions and knowing the types of conjunctions is going to make knowing the comma rule super, super, super easy. So last class meeting with the videos, with our second comma rule, we looked at coordinating conjunctions, which is our fanboys that bring two independent clauses together, right? Subordinating conjunctions typically are what you'll see your dependent clauses start with. Well, what are they? So here is an acronym. We had fanboys for our coordinating conjunctions. Subordinating conjunctions, it's AWUBIS, and it's a little longer, but after, which we've already practiced with, although, as, when, oops, while, excuse me, I about left that one off. See, I wasn't paying attention. When, while, until, because, before, if, and since. Okay? So, if you can remember AWUBIS, after, although, as, when, while, until, because, before, if, and since, this is going to help you to remember where you might need a comma or where you won't need a comma, depending on where this part of the sentence is placed. So, again, like I gave you the example here, if we start the sentence with after, with that subordinating conjunction, then we're going to have a sentence where we have to have a comma separating that dependent clause from that independent clause. So let's do one more example together. So I'm just going to randomly pick because. Let's talk about this one for just a second. Think back to all of your years of school, right? You've probably had a teacher at some point tell you, never answer a question by starting with the word because, right? The reason they told you that, guys, is because if you just said, because I was hungry, that is a dependent clause, therefore it is an incomplete sentence. However, if you will begin the sentence and make sure you still have the independent clause in there, you can start a sentence with because. So, I can't go to the concert because I am grounded. Okay? So let's look at that sentence. I can't go to the concert. That is my independent clause. Here's my subject. Can't go. Okay? So I can't go to the concert. And then look, because this is where my dependent clause starts. I'm going to put a box around that. Okay? So this is my independent clause. This is my dependent clause. Right? Now, according to our comma rule, do we need a comma in this sentence? No, because we started with the independent clause. So, let's rewrite this sentence to where it does need a comma. We're going to start with that dependent clause. Because I am grounded, comma, I can't go to the concert. Okay? I've started with the dependent clause. Therefore, I have to use a comma. My subject and my verb are here. This is my independent clause. So, if you ever have a teacher tell you that you can't start a sentence with because, throw them off. Make sure that you are using both a dependent and an independent clause, and make sure you put that comma at the end of your dependent clause. Okay? So, just a quick little recap, and I'm pulling out my tissue to erase. Subordinating conjunctions will help you to determine if you have a dependent clause. If you see this word in a sentence, you have a dependent clause somewhere, be it at the beginning or the end. Just know you use a comma at the beginning. So this is kind of a recap from looking at what we did in the last comma rule, but it's a good reminder with independent and dependent clauses. If I have two independent clauses, I can separate them by a period, or I can separate them with a comma conjunction, right? Now you've learned if you have an independent clause before a dependent clause, you're not going to have a comma. However, if you have the dependent clause before the independent clause, you have to make sure that you put that comma there. All right? So, that is your third comma rule. And again, knowing the parts of speech and knowing those conjunctions, and also knowing verbs and where verbs begin and how subjects are typically nouns, knowing those parts are going to help you to quickly and easily figure this out and get it put together. Okay? So that's comma rule 3, and here in just a second, we'll get into comma rule 4.